biblical tales. God floods the earth, sparing Noah, his family, and 2 of every animal on board his ark.
Now, an international team of researchers have found new evidence that a famous formation in Turkey could be the site of the ancient vessel.
Now, a group of researchers from different countries says they may have uncovered new proof that a mysterious formation in Turkey could actually be connected to an ancient ship spoken about for centuries. When the excavation first began on Turkey's tallest mountain region, the team expected a routine archaeological mission. Their goal was simple: search for ancient traces buried beneath the ground. But only a few days into the project, everything changed. The researchers came across a sealed area that instantly made the entire crew uneasy. Some even believed they might be looking at the remains of Noah's Ark. But the true panic started after the first underground scan. What appeared on the screen didn't resemble an ordinary ship at all. The moment the image showed up inside the field laboratory, the atmosphere completely shifted. Nobody spoke. Every person in the room was frozen, staring silently at the monitor. And before we reveal what the team saw in those scans, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because this mystery only gets more shocking from here. As the hours passed, tension inside the camp grew stronger. A few members of the expedition became so disturbed that they wanted the excavation stopped immediately. Soon, the situation escalated to the point where authorities suddenly intervened, and without giving any proper explanation, the entire site was closed off. At that moment, the mystery was no longer about what had been discovered beneath the mountain. The bigger question became far more disturbing. What exactly did they find that was considered too dangerous or shocking to reveal publicly? And trust me, as this story unfolds, the discoveries only become more unbelievable and far more terrifying. Deep in the mountainous region of eastern Turkey lies a strange place known as the Durupınar Formation. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than an ordinary slope on a mountain, but when viewed from the sky, its outline looks shockingly similar to a gigantic ship buried beneath the earth. For decades, many people have believed this could be the final resting place of Noah's Ark. And this is where the mystery truly begins. On one side, the Bible describes the story of Noah, the Ark, and a catastrophic flood that covered the world. On the other side, modern scientists dismiss the entire idea as mythology. According to many experts, a worldwide flood of that scale simply could not have happened the way ancient texts describe it. Yet strangely enough, flood legends exist in cultures all across the world. That's exactly why locations like the Durupınar Formation continue to fascinate researchers and mystery hunters alike. In 2021, a Turkish archaeological team officially began excavating the site. At first, the mission was straightforward: determine whether the formation was simply a natural geological shape or something far more unusual. During the early stages, researchers collected soil samples and discovered traces of marine material buried deep within the area. In other words, substances normally found near oceans were somehow present high in the mountains. At first, the excavation moved slowly and without any major surprises. But everything changed the moment the team brought in ground-penetrating radar, also known as GPR, a technology used to detect hidden structures beneath the surface without digging everything up. The researchers expected ordinary rock formations and uneven geological layers. Instead, the radar revealed something that immediately stunned the entire team. Beneath the ground appeared a massive hollow space. It wasn't solid stone. It looked structured, organized, almost artificial. As more scans were completed, the shape became clearer and clearer. And then came the moment that truly shocked everyone. The dimensions of the structure seemed to closely match the measurements described in the Bible for Noah's Ark, nearly 300 cubits in length. Some members of the team quickly referenced Genesis 6:15, the verse describing the ark's proportions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Suddenly, what once sounded like nothing more than an ancient story began to resemble a real object hidden beneath the mountain. The field laboratory fell silent. Nobody knew what to say. There was excitement, of course, but even stronger than the excitement was fear and confusion. Because if this truly was connected to an ancient ship, then one terrifying question remained. How could something like this even exist? From a scientific perspective, it shouldn't. Experts explain that a wooden vessel of such enormous size would struggle to support its own weight, especially without modern engineering techniques. And if it had really existed thousands of years ago, surviving underground for all that time would be nearly impossible. Moisture, pressure, decay, and time should have destroyed it long ago. That's when disagreements inside the team began to grow. Some archaeologists insisted the formation was completely natural and that the team was simply misinterpreting random patterns in the rock. They argued that the human mind naturally tries to recognize familiar shapes, even where none actually exist. But not everyone agreed. Several engineers studying the radar data became increasingly convinced that this was not an ordinary geological formation. According to them, the signals coming back from the scans were far too consistent. The reflections appeared evenly spaced and unusually symmetrical, something rarely seen in nature. One engineer reportedly said, "Natural rock formations don't create straight, evenly spaced corridors or beam-like patterns." The moment those words were spoken, the atmosphere inside the camp became noticeably heavier. This was no longer simple curiosity. It was turning into something much more disturbing. As the team continued scanning the site from multiple angles and different depths, the images only became clearer. What appeared on the monitor no longer resembled random shapes inside a mountain. Inside the structure, pathway-like sections began to emerge, long passage-like spaces that looked intentionally designed. In several areas, these sections even appeared connected, almost like rooms and corridors inside a massive constructed object. And the most unsettling detail of all, the partitions between them were perfectly uniform. In nature, symmetry like that is extremely uncommon. Natural rock layers are usually uneven, broken, irregular, and chaotic. But this structure looked strangely organized, almost as if it had been built according to a blueprint. A senior engineer stared at the scans for several moments before quietly saying, "This cannot be random. This is design." And after that, the tension inside the room became impossible to ignore. Even the people who once believed it was only a natural formation suddenly stopped talking. Some members of the team were now visibly afraid. The excitement that once filled the camp was slowly being replaced by something much darker. Every new scan answered one question, but created several more, and with each discovery, the mystery only became harder to explain. As the researchers gained a better understanding of the structure's internal layout, they decided to perform deeper scans using stronger settings and higher sensitivity. Everyone assumed they would simply uncover more of the same corridors and beam-like patterns, but what appeared next changed everything. On the monitor, the team noticed what looked like a sealed chamber, a hidden section slightly separated from the rest of the structure, almost as if it had been intentionally isolated. Then came the moment that shocked everyone. Inside that chamber, the instruments detected a faint heat signature. At first, nobody believed it. The team assumed the equipment had malfunctioned because something buried that deep underground, especially something believed to be ancient, should not be producing heat. Any object hidden beneath the earth for thousands of years should have been completely cold and lifeless. But when thermal imaging was activated and the team zoomed in closer, they saw it clearly. A bright thermal spot was glowing inside the chamber. This wasn't random interference or a weak signal. It was stable, defined, and unmistakable, as if something within that sealed space was actively generating heat. The entire room instantly went silent. One technician quickly measured the depth of the anomaly. The signal appeared to be coming from nearly 8 feet below the surface, directly from inside the isolated section. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then someone quietly whispered, "That shouldn't be possible." To verify the reading, the team immediately performed another scan. But when the second results appeared, the exact same pattern showed up again. Identical location, identical intensity, identical heat signature. At that point, there was no longer any doubt. Something inside the chamber was still producing energy. By now, curiosity had completely transformed into fear. The researchers struggled to explain what they were seeing. If the heat had a natural cause, it should have fluctuated or faded. Instead, the signal remained perfectly steady, but the mystery was about to become even stranger. After the thermal readings, the team began closely examining the radar reflections coming from inside the structure. That's when they noticed another disturbing anomaly. Certain signals behaved differently from everything else around them. When those readings were isolated and analyzed, it became obvious that they did not resemble ordinary stone or decayed wood. The reflections carried a metallic signature, the kind of echo radar produces when it encounters metal surfaces. At first, the researchers suspected it might simply be underground minerals, but the clearer the scans became, the harder that explanation was to believe. The mapping data seemed to show metallic reinforcements hidden within the structure itself, almost like metal had been intentionally used to strengthen beams, walls, or joints. And that possibility terrified the team, because if it were true, it meant this wasn't just a primitive wooden structure. It had been engineered. The biggest problem was that the structure supposedly belonged to a time period thousands of years in the past, possibly the Bronze Age or even earlier. Civilizations from that era were never believed to possess the technology required to build a massive reinforced structure with internal metal support. One engineer stared silently at the scans before finally saying, "This resembles modern engineering." The room fell silent once again. Until now, the discoveries had merely seemed unusual, but now they were becoming genuinely frightening, because this no longer felt ancient. It felt advanced. Everything uncovered so far, the symmetrical design, the heat source, the metallic readings, had already created unease within the team. But soon, the situation stopped being only scientific. It started affecting people psychologically and spiritually. One member of the expedition, who was deeply familiar with biblical texts, suddenly mentioned a verse from Matthew 24:37. Quietly, he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the last days." The atmosphere changed immediately. Up until that moment, the discussion had been centered around scans, data, and engineering. But now, the conversation moved into something far more emotional. The researcher explained that the verse described how, before the Great Flood, people continued living normal lives while ignoring warnings, until disaster suddenly arrived. Several team members became visibly uncomfortable hearing this comparison. Some even admitted the story felt disturbingly connected to the modern world. Today, people continue ignoring warnings about global crises, climate change, instability, and moral decline, carrying on as if nothing is wrong. And now, standing over a structure possibly connected to one of history's greatest flood legends, those ideas felt far more unsettling than before. Slowly, fear began spreading through the camp. A few researchers openly argued that the investigation should be stopped entirely. One member reportedly said, "If this information becomes public, people could panic." Another warned that this discovery was no longer just archaeology. It could trigger worldwide fear, speculation, and chaos. Inside the field laboratory, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The excitement was gone. Only tension remained. People spoke quietly, almost in whispers, as though something deeply disturbing had already been uncovered. But despite the fear, the team decided they needed answers. Until now, all observations had been made from outside the structure. But after detecting the chamber and the strange energy readings, the researchers finally decided to attempt physical access for the very first time. They prepared a narrow micro-bore probe, designed to enter the sealed section through a tiny drilled opening. As the drilling began, every eye in the lab focused on the monitors. The outer surface appeared extremely solid, so the team expected heavy resistance. But the moment the probe pushed forward, it moved inside surprisingly easily. That alone was unsettling. From the outside, the structure seemed dense and impenetrable, yet internally, it felt almost as if a pathway had already existed. And then, something happened that nobody expected. The instant the probe entered the chamber, the radiation detector suddenly reacted. At first, the screen displayed normal green levels. Then, within seconds, it shifted to yellow. And moments later, orange. And that orange warning meant only one thing. The radiation levels inside the chamber were continuing to rise. The lab instantly went quiet. Nobody could explain how a sealed chamber, supposedly thousands of years old and believed to be made of wood, could still be emitting radiation. It didn't fit any normal scientific explanation. But before the researchers could even process that discovery, another disturbing reading appeared on the monitors. The pressure sensors began detecting movement inside the chamber. Not random movement, rhythmic movement. The air pressure inside was increasing and decreasing in a steady cycle, almost as if something hidden within the chamber was slowly expanding and then contracting. That was the moment the atmosphere inside the lab truly changed. The team had already been shaken by the scans, but now they decided to analyze the actual material inside the structure. Using the micro-bore probe, they extracted tiny samples from the inner walls and immediately ran tests in the field laboratory. At first, everyone assumed the material would simply be wood fragments, dust, or soil. But the results stunned them. The analysis showed that the walls of the chamber were covered with a thick black coating of pitch or tar, and that detail immediately caught everyone's attention. Because according to Genesis 6:14, Noah was instructed to seal the ark from the inside and outside using pitch. That alone was shocking enough, but the deeper analysis made the discovery even stranger. Under microscopic examination, the pitch wasn't ordinary material. Mixed within it were traces of ash and strange crystal-like particles, unlike any local mineral found in the region. And the most unsettling part, the crystal formations didn't appear random. They seemed structured, almost intentionally arranged. One researcher stared at the microscope images before quietly saying, "This doesn't look natural. There's some kind of pattern here." The uneasiness returned immediately. Then one of the team members, who specialized in ancient Hebrew, pointed out something that made the situation even more disturbing. He explained that the Hebrew word used in the Bible for pitch, kopher, does not simply mean waterproof ceiling. It can also mean covering, protecting, or even containing something so it cannot escape. That interpretation changed everything. If the coating had only been used to block water, that would be understandable. But if its true purpose had been to keep something trapped inside, then the entire meaning of the chamber became terrifying. By this point, every discovery, the heat source, the radiation, the pressure fluctuations, seemed to point toward the same frightening conclusion. And then came the discovery that pushed the team over the edge. Bones. The team had already been deeply unsettled, but after reviewing the probe data, they decided to investigate a narrow tunnel connected to the sealed chamber. The passageway was tight, dark, and almost completely buried. Using a robotic arm fitted with a small camera, the researchers slowly guided the device deeper inside. The moment the light illuminated the tunnel for the first time, the entire room froze. Something was scattered across the ground. At first glance, it looked like splintered wood or debris. But as the camera moved closer, the horrifying truth became clear. They were bones, and there was something terribly wrong about them. Their shape was unusual. Their color looked unnatural. Even the way they were positioned felt disturbing. But the most frightening detail of all was this. The bones were not scattered randomly. They appeared arranged, placed deliberately. One researcher quietly whispered, "This doesn't look like collapsed debris. It looks organized, almost like a quarantine site." The room fell silent again. Now the team began carefully examining the skeletal remains through the camera feed. The ribs were the first thing they noticed. They were packed far too closely together for any normal animal. A creature with a rib structure like that wouldn't even be able to breathe properly by modern biological standards. It didn't resemble any known mammal. Then the camera focused on the jaw, and things became even more disturbing. The jaw structure appeared partially reptilian, but not entirely. It contained a strange, double-hinged design, allowing the mouth to open far wider than normal. The teeth were even stranger, different sizes, different shapes, completely irregular. Nothing about it matched any known species. But the most horrifying feature was the spine. It wasn't straight. The backbone curved in a twisted spiral-like formation, almost as though the body itself had developed unnaturally. One member of the team stared at the screen and quietly said, "We've never seen skeletal anatomy like this before." At that point, curiosity disappeared completely. Only fear remained. Some researchers physically stepped away from the monitors. Others refused to keep looking. Because this was no longer an archaeological mystery. It was becoming something beyond explanation. But the worst shock was still waiting. After recovering samples from the bones, the team decided to perform DNA sequencing. Tiny fragments were carefully collected by the robotic arm and inserted into a portable analysis machine. Everyone in the room watched the screen in silence, because whatever appeared next could finally reveal the truth. At first, the machine displayed incomplete fragments and partial sequences. But as the analysis continued, the technicians' expressions slowly changed. The system repeatedly searched for matches within the global DNA database. Each time, the answer came back the same. No match found. The room became deathly quiet. The samples did not match mammals. They did not match reptiles. They did not match birds. They matched nothing known to science. Finally, the system labeled the sequence with a single word: unknown. That meant only two possibilities remained. Either the DNA belonged to a completely extinct species. This genetic structure doesn't align with any modern organism. It's different. And suddenly, everyone in the room was thinking the same terrifying thought. That was when one of the biblical scholars on the expedition mentioned Genesis 6:4, the passage describing the Nephilim. He explained that the text speaks of beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal, but something altered, corrupted, or mixed into another form altogether. That theory made the atmosphere inside the lab even more disturbing, because if those remains truly belonged to something unnatural, then maybe Noah had not brought them onto the ark to protect them, but to isolate them. Suddenly, the purpose of the ark no longer seemed limited to saving life from the flood. It began to feel more like a massive containment